have you ever wondered how to set up your own DHCP server using PEGs? Why this talk is actually about pigeons? Or why teapots and HTTP seem to be a thing? So this talk was very much inspired by a conversation between myself and another CSEC alumni. So Helen, who was former president of CSEC, and I had a very interesting conversation around some of the more interesting and more humorous things that you do see as you get to know your way around the industry. So this is very much where the idea came from for this talk, and today I'll just give you a very brief walkthrough on April Fool's RFCs. So before I do begin, there is a bit of a disclaimer that I do need to sort of provide about the status of this particular presentation. So I will read this out. This presentation provides information for the InfoSec community. It does not specify an internet standard of any kind. This talk is inspired by requests for comments, or RFCs. These are the documents, tomes, and archives that form both the history and the glue of the internet that we see today. The views presented herein are my own as a member of the public. They do not represent the views or endorsement of my employer, nor any person or organisation affiliated with RFCs or April 1st. No pigeons were harmed in the making of this presentation. However, a lot of tea was consumed and the occasional coffee. So, who am I? My name is Cam Lau, and I am a current advisory board member here at UTS CSEC. I studied ICT engineering at UTS, and I've spent a lot of time over the years in really strange places, dangling off the side of buildings, enjoying the delights of ceiling spaces at 1 in the morning, overlooking the edge of mining sites, all to bring data and information back where it had no absolute business of being there. So places that had no electricity, no power, yet somehow we had to get data, surveillance, and information returning back home. So I spend a lot of time tinkering. I enjoy making stuff occasionally. Most of the time it's breaking instead. During the day, I work in DFIR, or Digital Forensics Incident Response. I have been captured by a law firm, and we do both internal and external cybersecurity work with them. And I do have a preference for G. All right. So before I go into RFCs and the like, I do want to start off with a bit of a story. And this story is very much about pigeons, cars, and the Australian internet. Like many stories, this one starts with a challenge. And this challenge was made by Kevin Rudd, our then Prime Minister of Australia, in October of 2009. So this is in the context of the NBN rollout. So before we had NBN, we were still dealing with things like dial-up, with ADSL, with not being able to connect to the internet, and just all around general unreliability of information. So this particular challenge was, if the Liberals had their way, Australians would be left using carrier pigeons for the future, rather than accessing a competitive broadband network. Like any good challenge, a team within Australia decided to test this particular statement. So ABC's Hungry Beasts, which is at the time a local news and current affairs satire show, went about fact-checking this. So, and then they dubbed this particular challenge the Great Australian Internet Challenge. Feel free to take a copy of the YouTube link. You can take a look at the actual video yourself. So what was the challenge? The challenge was who could transfer 700 megabytes, which was really, really large back then, the fastest between point a New South Wales rural country town called Tarona, to Prospect in the middle of Sydney. So fibre didn't exist back then. A lot of techs were measuring the internet speed in kilometres from the telephone exchange. And the challenges for this particular challenge? So you had the internet using an ADSL connection. You had the car, so a V8 Ford Falcon, and Margaret, the racing pigeon. So this picture is just a representation of the path taken by Margaret to get from point A to point B. So now the question is, who actually won? It may not come as a surprise, but Margaret was the winner of this particular challenge. So she came in a resounding first place with a 1 hour lead ahead of the next competitor, the Ford Falcon. The internet scored the wooden spoon and a DNF after disconnecting twice during the challenge and never recovering. So what does this talk even have to do with, this talk or RFCs? All right, let's go back. So this can be considered a rudimentary implementation of various protocols described in the avian carrier series of the RFC standards. These are RFC 1149, the standard for the transmission of IP datagrams over avian carriers, first published in 1990. RFC 2549, IP over avian carriers with quality of service. So we're slowly improving. And then there's an adaptation for RFC as well, which is RFC 6214, adaptation for RFC 1149 for IPv6. So there's a bit of a common theme going on here. These and many more of the RFCs all share, which is a bit of humour and generally being published around April 1st. So that is very much the premise of this talk. And we'll go further into a bit more of these RFCs. But first, when we first look into that, what is an RFC in the first place? So RFC, request for comment. It is an archival record of the standards and best practices used by the internet. It's maintained by an organisation called the RFC Editor, and their goal is to provide a canonical source of the material published by the RFC Editor to support the preservation of that material in perpetuity. So think of it a bit as a fossil record of the internet. So very much a good read on the history of how we evolved to where we are today. So some of the common sort of protocols that you'll see that you may interact with that are actually defined in the RFCs are things like TCP, UDP, HTTP, and cryptographic algorithms like RSA. And let's see. So for every single major computing protocol that you may encounter or know today, majority of them are actually defined here. So the RFCs are actually fairly old. They are originally associated with ARPANET, which is the precursor to the internet. So the very first RFC was published in 1969 by Steve Crocker, and RFC1 is called host software. In the time since then, we've had it's been 50 years since then, over 9,000 RFCs have since been published. So the very first ones were handwritten or typed out using word processors, including ASCII art and Courier font. So what you actually see here is very much an example of what you'll see when you read up an RFC. So what kind of things do they cover? It's not just the protocols that we discussed earlier. They can cover topics including history, literature, and art. So you've got some poems here. Poems here from Christmas, a bit of information on the word foo and where it came from, as well as a bit of history as well for the RFC process. Now, the April 1st RFCs are a special category of RFC that helps celebrate the submissions, submissions that are clever, humorous, and topical that are associated with computer networking. The first April 1st RFC was published in 1978, and it is called RFC 748, Telnet Randomly Lost Option. There are now over 50 April 1st RFCs that have since been published. There are some particular statements that do get provided by the RFC editor. So in this case, note that in past years, the RFC editor has sometimes published serious documents with April 1st dates. Readers who cannot distinguish satire by reading the text may have a future in marketing. Here are some highlights from around the grounds and in my research. You have RFC 9225, software defects considered harmful. RFC 8150, the art of ASCII, and true and accurate representation of a menagerie of things, fabulous and wonderful in ye form of character. As well as RFC 2322, which is management of IP numbers by PEG DHCP. Very much inspired by these kinds of conferences and having to go through and manage how do you do CTFs and LANs with a whole bunch of people connecting together. So there's a particular RFC that has inspired a bit of a meme around the InfoSec community and then the internet itself, and that is HTTP status code 418, I'm a teapot. Where does it come from? It comes from a particular RFC, which is 2324, also known as Hypertext Coffee Pot Control Protocol, first published in 1998. This has a serious purpose. It identifies many of the ways in which HTTP has been extended inappropriately. So this I'm a teapot quote is actually a return code for this particular protocol, 418. Any attempt to brew coffee with a teapot should result in the error code, 4188. The resulting entity may be short and stout. So you may see a few teapots in the wild in your travels. Google happens to have a link to that. Feel free to follow and take a look. You'll actually find it in your Python documentation as well. And there was a bit of drama a couple of years ago around removing status code 418 from various libraries. So if you want to sort of relive that time period, feel free to look up the hashtag save418. Because of the lack of consideration to actually incorporating teapots into the Hypertext Coffee Pot Protocol, there was an addendum that was made. So this is RFC 7168, Hypertext Coffee Pot Protocol for tea, efflux applications. So over time, as we discover sort of protocols and practice, you'll see that a lot of updates and addendums are made to the RFCs, including this one. So in closing out, anybody can actually submit an April 1st RFC. There is no formal review process, as opposed to submitting one that's a little bit more serious. If you do want it to be considered, you do need to submit it at least 2 weeks prior to April 1st. And this is the recommended criteria. So they must relate to the internet. Readers should reach the end of page 2 before realizing it's an April 1st RFC. They must actually be funny. All right. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope you enjoyed.